28 people, most of them South Americans, crowded into a space of 2.5 meters by 3 meters. The far wall was made of luggage, snow, rubbish, and chairs. But the main shelter from the cold was the stripped fuselage of the plane. The wrecked passengers stripped the seat covers to keep warm, and the cushions served as their snowshoes. They found a way to get water by turning the sheet metal from under the seats into a kind of solar collector. The snow was placed on top of it, it melted, and the water flowed into empty bottles. Someone also had the idea to make sunglasses out of cockpit sun shields, wire, and bra straps. They could protect at least a few people from snow blindness. It was only the second day after the plane had crashed in a remote mountainous region at an altitude of 3,500 meters. The creepiness and implausibility of what happened next made the crash of Flight 571 known as the Miracle of the Andes. Uruguayan rugby team Old Christians from Montevideo were to face their rivals in Santiago. The club president organized a special flight for the trip. 40 passengers and 5 crew members boarded. The underpowered plane, nicknamed the Lead Sled, flew 792 hours in 4 years. Colonel Julio Cesar Faridas took it into the air on 12 October 1972. An experienced Air Force pilot, he crossed the Andes 29 times that day to train co-pilot Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Lagara. Over the Andes, Flight 71 was caught in a storm and made an immediate landing at the Argentine city of Mendoza. Although there was a direct route from this point, FH-227 was directed along a 600-kilometer U-ramp due to the technical characteristics. Over the Planchon Pass, Argentine air traffic controllers hand over flight tracking duties to their Chilean counterparts. Over the mountains south of Curacao, the aircraft is to turn north, fly 60 to 70 kilometers towards the city, and 11 minutes later begin its descent for landing in Santiago. On 12 October, there was a cloud cover, and the pilots were flying by instrument readings. Lagora contacted air traffic control over the pass and said he would reach Curacao in 1 minute. After another 3 minutes, he asked for permission to descend. On receiving an answer, the pilot steered the plane towards the ground. Subsequent investigation showed that he had turned too early and was on the wrong course. This caused the aircraft to descend directly over the mountain range. The pilots only realized this when the ground collision alarm went off. The passengers finally stopped joking about the turbulence when the aircraft was almost vertical. The pilot tried to gain altitude, but it was too late. At 15:34, he hit a ridge with his tail at an altitude of 4,200 meters. During the second collision, the aircraft lost its right wing. The force of the impact tore off the entire rear of the fuselage with the luggage compartment, kitchen, and 2 rows of seats. 3 passengers, the navigator, and flight attendants were the first casualties of the crash. After flying another couple of 100 meters, the lead sled was cut by one of the propellers of the left wing that broke off. 2 more passengers fell out. The remains of the fuselage accelerated to 350 kilometers per hour before crashing into blocks of snow. The collision crushed the cockpit with the pilots and tore off all the seats, tampering them into the nose of the craft. The wreckage came to a halt at an altitude of 3,570 meters, 80 kilometers from its planned route. 7 people died at that time. One of the people who fell out in flight suffocated after being trapped in the deep snow. 4 passengers died when they collided with the embankment. Then Colonel Faridas died, and the co-pilot was trapped in the crushed cockpit. He asked the survivors to kill him, but they refused. Of the 45 men, 33 survived, but 5 more passengers died of their injuries on the first night. First-year student medics Roberto Canassa and Gustavo Zerbino helped the injured. None of the critically injured survived, except Nando Parado, who spent 3 days in a coma because of a fractured skull. When he woke up, he found out that his mother had died and his 19-year-old sister had been fatally injured. 4 planes searched for Flight 571 the first night, 11 more the following day. Some of them flew directly over the crash site, but the white fuselage could not be seen against the snow. Passengers didn't have enough lipstick to write SOS on board. The crashed plane was searched for a total of more than 140 hours. The survivors repaired the radio and built a makeshift aerial. On 21 October, they heard that they had called off the search. Gustavo Nikolic, a veterinary student, broke the news to his comrades huddled in the fuselage, calling it bad news. The confident young man now announced that they were going to get out on their own, and his determination saved the men from utter despair. The leader of the survivors was rugby team captain Marcelo Perez. Virtually no one had ever seen snow or been to the mountains before. Those flying from Uruguay to Chile did not take their winter clothes with them, and temperatures dropped to negative 30 degrees Celsius at night. The 27 people shared all the food they had: 8 bars of chocolate, a tin of mussels, 3 tins of jam, a packet of almonds, a couple of figs, prunes, sweets, and a few bottles of wine. Parado ate 1 chocolate-covered walnut in 3 days. With this diet, all the food ran out in a week. People began to eat leather upholstery seats and cotton fabrics, but this worsened their conditions. There was only one option for survival, too horrible to speak of. All the survivors were Catholics. For the next few days, they prayed, fighting hunger and despair in this way. Some weakening passengers consented to have their flesh eaten by the living comrades after their death. Some remembered the words of the Bible: "There is no greater love than that a man lay down his life for his friends." Canasa was the first to cross the line, followed by the others. By that time, they were already on their 17th day in the icy high mountain hell. It seemed to be the worst, but it was only the beginning of the torment. An avalanche hit the fuselage at midnight. A torrent of snow killed 8 people, including the survivors' leader, while the rest were trapped inside. Soon, the men began to suffocate. Nando Parado dug a small hole in the hull for ventilation. It took 2 days to dig a tunnel to freedom. There, they encountered a new problem: a heavy snowstorm. The men were forced back into the cramped room from the fuselage and stayed there for 3 days along with the bodies of their dead comrades. When the temperature in the mountains began to rise slightly, the 4 men went out to explore for the first time. After walking just over a kilometer, the expedition came across the wreckage of the plane's tail, which contained surviving luggage and batteries. That night, they lit a fire and read comic books late into the night. But a second night in the mountains nearly killed them. The men had to go back to the tailgate and then took to the radio to send out a distress signal. There was a storm on the way which caused them to make it miraculously, and then it turned out that the batteries wouldn't do them any good. 2 more passengers died of gangrene before it was reported that the search for the downed flight had resumed. A student who weighed just 25 kilograms died 60 days after the crash. The others made the willful decision to seek help on their own and cross the mountains. The survivors realized that the journey would take days and would be freezing at night. Someone suggested sewing a huge sleeping bag. Insulating and waterproofing materials from the tail of the plane were used. Luckily, one of the passengers knew how to sew and willingly taught the others. Soon, the bag was ready. But it proved more difficult to find volunteers to go into the mountains with Parado. And yet, on December 12, 1972, Parado, Canessa, and Antonio Vizilin, without experience or equipment, began the climb. The trio were guided by the pilot's words of their approximate location. The expedition had only 3 days' worth of food. Parado walked in 3 pairs of trousers, a shirt, 3 jumpers, 4 pairs of socks wrapped in bags. Even that wasn't particularly saving when all the men were up to their waists in snow. The first night, a storm broke out, and the men had to stop over a precipice. Canessa later called it the worst night of his life. Those left in camp watched the ascent for 3 days. The men climbed a peak of 4,670 meters and were stunned by what they saw. There were only mountains, no Chilean valleys. Parado and Canessa decided they'd rather face death together than wait for it to come to them. They had hardly any food, so Visitin agreed to return to camp. The 2 men walked along the ridge for several more days. They found the Rio San Jose Spring, followed the riverbed, and finally crossed the snowbank. Soon they began to see signs of human activity. Only on the 9th day did the men see a few cows. By this time, they were deadly tired, having walked 61 kilometers in 10 days through the lifeless Andes. While trying to light a fire on the riverbank, Parado saw 3 riders. He called out to them, but it was impossible to talk because of the noise of the water. The first person the survivors had seen in so many days said one terrible word: tomorrow. The following day, mule driver Sergio Catalan returned. He threw a paper and pencil to the strangers. When the Chilean received in return a note as to who they were, he was astonished. He left the men some food and went off to get help. The horseman rode for 10 hours until he met the first locals. He asked them to pick up Parado and Canassa and cross the mountains to the only bridge near the nearest village. From there, a passing truck dropped them off at a police station in Puente Negro. They contacted the military in San Fernando, and only then were the survivors reported to Santiago. 72 days after the crash, rescuers reached the remaining passengers who had already given up hope of being rescued. They were diagnosed with fractures, frostbite, scurvy, and many other illnesses. At the time of the rescue, Canassa weighed 44 kilos. The incredible story caught the world's attention, but the first thing journalists began to discuss was how the survivors had turned to cannibalism. But after the passengers gave a press conference and were supported by a Catholic priest, the hype eased. The plane's wreckage was burned, and the bodies of the dead were buried in a mass grave near the fuselage. The father of one of the victims asked for permission to exhume the bodies, but he was refused. The man then made his way to the burial, and after returning from the mountains, he was arrested for grave robbery. A federal judge and the local government came to the parents' defense. An obelisk was erected at the crash site, and the Parado and Canassa route became a tourist attraction. The story of the miracle in the Andes inspired the creation of a charitable foundation, a library, and many documentaries and historical works. Would you believe the story if you saw it in a film, for example? Share your impressions in the comments section, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so as to not to miss any new updates.